A millionaire accepted dinner at his Maid's home, but when he realized she'd spent her last savings. In the quiet affluence of Mercer Island, just across the waters from downtown Seattle, Matthew Callahan's estate stood like a monument to success. With its modern architecture, glass-paneled walls, and a panoramic view of Lake Washington, it was a world designed for silence, efficiency, and control. Matthew, a tech billionaire in his early 50s, had built his empire on algorithms and data, but kept his personal life as minimal as his digital footprint. Each day followed a predictable rhythm: black coffee at 6 o'clock in the morning, a gym session with his private trainer, then meetings either on-site or via encrypted calls in his home office. The only people who crossed his domestic threshold regularly were the housekeeper, the gardener, and his longtime maid, Rosa Martinez. Rosa had worked in the Callahan household for over 8 years. Originally from New Mexico, she was in her 40s, with a soft voice, gentle demeanor, and a precise way of folding linen that made her presence almost invisible. She came in every weekday around 9 o'clock in the morning, greeted the staff quietly, and began her routine. Matthew barely spoke to her beyond a polite good morning or a rare thank you, but he noticed the way his house always seemed to breathe a little better after she passed through. On a gray Wednesday afternoon, with a light drizzle painting the windows, Rosa was cleaning the marble kitchen island when Matthew walked in to make tea. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and rosemary. She hesitated for a moment, holding a dish towel, then turned to him with an uncertain smile. "Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice a notch softer than usual. Matthew looked up from his mug, distracted. "Yes, Rosa?" I was wondering..." She paused, glancing at the floor. "Home sometime? Would you like to have dinner?" There was a stillness in the room, as if even the hum of the refrigerator had momentarily ceased. Matthew blinked, caught off guard. For a man used to contracts, pitches, and meticulously planned events, the simplicity of her question felt oddly disarming. "You mean dinner with you at your house?" he asked, not with condescension but genuine curiosity. She nodded quickly, her hands fidgeting with the towel. "It wouldn't be anything fancy, just a meal. I cook well, and I thought, maybe if you ever wanted something different." He watched her for a moment. Her cheeks were tinged with a soft red, and she wouldn't quite meet his eyes. There was no agenda in her voice, no manipulation, just a quiet courage, asking for something without expecting anything in return. Matthew could have dismissed the invitation with a polite excuse. He had business dinners scheduled, functions with politicians and CEOs, gala invites. But something about the moment, perhaps the tone in her voice or the way she was standing with hope tucked inside her nerves, made him pause. He gave a small nod. "All right, that sounds nice." Rosa's eyes widened slightly, then her smile appeared, warm, shy, surprised. "Evening, around 6. Saturday." "Sure," he said, still uncertain why he had agreed. "Text me the address." She nodded again, and with a soft "thank you," she turned back to her task. Matthew finished his tea in silence, feeling the shift in his day like a pebble dropped in still water. It wasn't just the invitation that lingered in his mind, it was the way she had asked, as if offering something sacred, something personal, with nothing to gain but a shared moment. That night, back in his office, Matthew sat at his desk staring at the blinking cursor on a document. The words wouldn't come. Instead, his mind wandered, back to Rosa, to her quiet strength, to a dinner that felt more mysterious than any high-profile event on his calendar. He didn't tell anyone, not his assistant, not his siblings, not even his closest advisor. Some part of him didn't want to expose it to scrutiny. He wasn't sure what to expect, but for the first time in a while he felt the flicker of something unfamiliar, anticipation. He marked the date on his phone with a simple title, Dinner with Rosa, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he kept looking at it throughout the week. On Thursday morning, as sunlight broke through the clouds over Seattle and painted golden lines on the sleek countertops of Matthew Callahan's kitchen, Rosa entered the house quietly as always. But there was a barely perceptible shift in her demeanor. The silence between them felt less heavy now, as if the dinner invitation had cracked a door open in the solid wall that usually stood between employer and employee. Matthew, already dressed, in his tailored navy suit, stood by the window reading a brief on a tablet. When Rosa greeted him with her usual good morning, there was a faint warmth in her tone that hadn't been there before. He looked up, nodded, and offered a smile that almost reached his eyes. Throughout the day, the memory of her invitation returned to him in unexpected moments. During a meeting with international investors, his mind wandered back to her tentative voice. While reviewing the quarterly projections, he remembered the slight tremble in her fingers as she held the dish towel. He was surprised by how often he thought about her, not romantically, but as someone suddenly vivid, someone real in a way she hadn't been before. Rosa had always blended into the periphery of his life, like background music. Now she occupied a curious space in the forefront of his thoughts. Rosa, on the other hand, felt the weight of that yes as if it had shifted gravity in her small world. The moment Matthew agreed to come over, something changed, not just in her routine, but in her sense of self. She hadn't expected him to accept. In truth, she had rehearsed that invitation for weeks, telling herself she'd never actually say it. But when the words had escaped her lips, there was no taking them back. Back home in her modest apartment in Tacoma, the atmosphere was electric with quiet preparation. Her daughter Camilla, a bright-eyed 10-year-old with wild curls and an endless stream of questions, immediately sensed that something unusual was about to happen. Rosa didn't say much, just that someone important was coming over for dinner. But Camilla watched her mother clean the kitchen with double the usual intensity, scrub the floorboards on her knees, and write shopping lists on the back of old envelopes with a furrowed brow. "Is it your boss?" Camilla asked one night, peering over Rosa's shoulder as she calculated prices. Rosa looked up, caught off guard. "Why do you think that?" "Because you always talk about him like he's far away, and now you look nervous. You only look nervous when it's something big." Rosa smiled, brushing a lock of hair behind her daughter's ear. "You. Nothing more. It's just dinner, mi amor, I think." But she couldn't fool herself. This wasn't just about food, it was about dignity, about showing a part of herself she had kept locked away, her home, her heritage, her resilience. Matthew had seen her work day after day, but he'd never seen her life. And for reasons she didn't fully understand, she wanted him to. She wanted him to see that she was more than the woman who changed his sheets and kept his glass tables spotless. At the Eat supermarket on Friday, Rosa walked the aisles with deliberate care. She reached for ingredients she hadn't bought in years: real saffron, fresh poblano peppers, organic masa. Every item went into the cart with a small pang of guilt. She checked her balance at the self-checkout and winced. But she didn't put anything back. This wasn't a regular meal. It was a piece of her soul, plated and served. Back in Seattle, Matthew was pacing the marble hallway of his office. He had just turned down a last-minute invitation to an exclusive dinner hosted by a U.S. senator. His assistant looked at him with a puzzled expression when he declined. He simply said, "I have other plans." That was all. He hadn't told anyone about the dinner with Rosa, and he had no intention to. He was afraid they wouldn't understand. He could already hear the voices of his siblings in his head, Carter scoffing, Allison raising a suspicious eyebrow. They were products of the same elite world he had risen through, a world that measured worth by wealth, credentials, and connections. And yet, here he was, more intrigued by a woman who earned in a year what he made in a single hour. Saturday. Morning arrived with a pale blue sky and the promise of spring. Rosa woke up early and began her day with a mixture of nerves and resolve. She pulled out the best tablecloth she owned, white with delicate blue embroidery, a wedding gift from a cousin she hadn't seen in years. She cleaned every surface of their apartment again, as if the first round hadn't been enough. She asked Camilla to help polish the silverware, and together they laid the table with mismatched plates and ceramic bowls Rosa had brought from Santa Fe when she first moved north. As the clock ticked closer to the evening, Rosa changed into a simple navy dress, one of the few she kept pressed in the back of her closet for special occasions. She tied her hair into a neat bun and looked at herself in the mirror. She didn't look rich. She didn't look like the women Matthew probably dined with every week, but she looked like herself, and that had to be enough. Meanwhile, Matthew selected a bottle of red wine from his cellar, something full-bodied and rare, from a vineyard he had visited in Italy. He dressed casually but with taste, dark jeans, a tailored charcoal blazer, an open-collared white shirt. As he drove the 40-minute stretch from his lakeside mansion to Rosa's neighborhood in Tacoma, he couldn't help but notice the changes in scenery, the shift from manicured driveways to aging sidewalks, from glass towers to brick buildings with peeling paint. When he finally arrived at the small apartment complex, he parked discreetly and looked up at the units. It was a modest building, quiet and clean, with flower pots lining the front steps. He held the wine tightly in his hand, unsure if it was appropriate. He rang the doorbell and waited. The door opened and there she was, Rosa smiling nervously but warmly. The smell of roasted peppers and spices floated through the air. Camilla peeked from behind her mother, curiosity written all over her face. "Mr. Callahan," Rosa said, stepping aside. "Welcome." Matthew stepped in, taking in the humble surroundings, the framed photos on the walls, the crocheted blanket on the couch, the tiny table set with care. It was a world away from his own, yet it didn't feel lacking. It felt alive. "Please," she said, gesturing to the table, "make yourself at home." And so he did. The morning after Rosa received the unexpected confirmation from Matthew Callahan, she rose earlier than usual. The grey light outside had barely begun to illuminate the neighborhood, and Camilla was still asleep in the small room they shared. The apartment was quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic and the humming of the refrigerator. Rosa stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, thinking through the next 3 days with the same precision she brought to Matthew's household. She started by listing what she needed, not just ingredients for the meal, but things no one else would think of. She would repaint the door, polish the floor, and replace the torn curtain in the bathroom. Her apartment was always clean, but this was different. This dinner wasn't just a social visit. It felt like a reckoning, a mirror turned inward. She needed everything to be perfect, not for him, but for herself. That morning, she stopped at the local hardware store after work. She picked up a can of paint, brushes, and a small roll of wallpaper to fix the peeling edge in the hallway. The cashier scanned the items and gave her a curious look when she handed over a stack of crumpled bills. She smiled politely, ignored the glance, and walked home slowly, the bag digging into her fingers. At work, she said nothing. Not to the gardener, not to the private chef, not even when Matthew passed by her while talking on the phone. She cleaned his office as usual, emptied the trash, wiped the glass desk, and moved through the spaces with practiced quietness. If anyone noticed a change in her, they didn't say anything. But inside, her mind was a constant stream of thoughts, recipes, timing, expenses, details. She reviewed everything in silence, over and over again. At night, after Camilla had gone to bed, Rosa sat at the small dining table, running her fingers over her grocery list. There were items she hadn't cooked in years: her grandmother's green chili stew, handmade tamales, arroz con leche the way her mother made it when she was a child. These dishes weren't luxurious, but they carried history. Rosa had learned to cook out of necessity, but over the years food became something more. It was comfort, memory, offering. The next evening, she took the bus to a Latin market on the other side of Tacoma. She bought dried chiles, masa harina, canela sticks, and a small jar of imported honey. Her budget was tight. Every purchase had to be justified. She carried a notepad with her, crossing off items carefully, calculating each total in her head. She had always been cautious with money, but now every dollar was a deliberate choice. It wasn't just about feeding a guest, it was about doing justice to her culture, her story, her pride. At home, Camilla began to pick up on the tension behind her mother's focus. She was an observant child, wise beyond her years in a quiet way. She noticed the smell of paint in the hallway, the new rug by the door, the way Rosa carefully pressed a blouse that had hung in the closet untouched for years. "Is he really that important?" Camilla asked one evening, sitting at the edge of the kitchen counter. Rosa looked up from the dough she was kneading. Her hands were dusted with flour. "He's just a man," she said after a pause. "But sometimes one moment can tell a person who you really are, and I want this moment to speak the truth." Camilla didn't fully understand, but she nodded. She trusted her mother's words. Later that night, Rosa tucked her in with an extra-long embrace. She thought about the sacrifices she had made, leaving school, burying dreams, working long hours for a man who barely knew her. But she had never given up on dignity, and this dinner, strange as it was, had become a vessel for that dignity. The apartment slowly transformed. Rosa repainted the front door a deep forest green, the same color as the one from her childhood home in Santa Fe. She rearranged the furniture in the living room so it felt less cramped. She added fresh flowers to a chipped vase she placed in the center of the table. She even borrowed a folding chair from a neighbor so that all three of them could sit together without squeezing. Each night, Camilla helped with small tasks, ironing napkins, folding place cards, peeling vegetables. She had never seen her mother so focused, so determined. There was no music playing, no laughter, but the atmosphere was tender in its own quiet way. By Thursday evening, Rosa's bank account was nearly empty. She checked her balance twice, hoping there was a mistake. There wasn't, but she didn't panic. She had kept an emergency stash, a glass jar in the back of her closet, filled with coins and small bills she had been collecting for years. She broke it open. The sound of coins hitting the floor echoed in the apartment. Camilla rushed in and stopped at the door, watching silently as Rosa began counting. It was barely enough, but it would cover the last purchases. Rosa sighed and gave her daughter a reassuring smile. "We'll be fine," she whispered, as much to herself as to Camilla. Friday was dedicated to cleaning. Rosa scrubbed every corner of the apartment until her fingers ached. She washed the curtains, polished the window panes, and replaced the broken handle on the bathroom door. She borrowed a tablecloth from a neighbor and pressed it until it was crisp and smooth. Her back hurt, her knees throbbed, but she kept going. That night, as Camilla slept, Rosa sat alone at the kitchen table, her hands folded. The apartment was ready. The food would be cooked the next day. There was nothing left to clean, nothing left to fix. And yet, she felt the tension in her shoulders, the flutter in her chest. She wasn't afraid of Matthew, but she was afraid of what he might see or not see. This dinner, which had started as a simple invitation, had become a silent plea to be understood. For years, Rosa had watched the world from the margins, serving, cleaning, observing, always present but rarely seen. Now for one night she would open her world. She would serve a meal not as a maid, but as a mother, a woman, a human being, and she would do it with everything she had. Saturday began early in Rosa's home, long before the sun had fully risen. The light outside was pale and bluish, filtering through the worn blinds as she stood barefoot in the kitchen, sipping a glass of water, her body tense with anticipation. The air inside the apartment was thick with the smell of spices and simmering broth. Every corner had already been cleaned, every detail reviewed a dozen times. Today, it was all about execution. By 8 o'clock in the morning, Rosa had already begun preparing the tamales. The dough had to be just right, soft but firm, moist without being sticky. She added lard and broth, kneading until the consistency reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen in New Mexico. The scent brought memories that stirred beneath the surface, warm afternoons, laughter in Spanish, a time when things felt simpler. She set the masa aside and began working on the fillings, slow-cooked pork in red chili sauce and roasted vegetables for the vegetarian option she suspected Matthew might prefer. Camilla helped in quiet focus, her small hands peeling garlic and washing cilantro under cold water. She had never seen her mother move with such intensity. There was a kind of reverence in the way Rosa sliced, stirred, and plated ingredients in stages. It wasn't just cooking, it was an act of devotion. Each movement was precise, intentional, filled with the weight of meaning that words could not carry. Outside, the neighborhood moved at its usual weekend pace. Children played in the parking lot, someone washed a car nearby, and the smell of grilled food wafted from a neighboring unit. But inside Rosa's apartment, time felt different. The hours passed in slow waves. She checked the clock obsessively. her hands never idle. She boiled corn husks, folded napkins, polished glassware. Every action felt critical, as though the balance of the evening depended on it. By noon, the kitchen counters were filled with pots and bowls. The chili stew simmered on the back burner, filling the space with warmth and a tangy fragrance that reminded Rosa of family reunions long past. She prepared arroz con leche last, letting the milk reduce slowly while stirring in cinnamon and lemon zest. It was Camilla's favorite dessert and a fitting end to the meal, simple but rich, comforting yet elegant. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Rosa changed into her dress, a modest navy piece with a high neckline and 3/4 sleeves. She applied a little foundation, brushed her hair back into a low bun and put on earrings she hadn't worn since Camilla's baptism. They were silver, shaped like tiny hummingbirds, a gift from her sister many years ago. She studied her reflection for a long moment. She didn't look like someone trying to impress a billionaire. She looked like someone trying to hold on to her self-worth with both hands. At 3 o'clock, she took out the last few dollars she had left and walked with Camilla to the nearby market. She needed fresh flowers. The cheapest bouquet, pink and white carnations, was $5. She hesitated, then bought it anyway. Back home, she trimmed the stems and arranged them in a mason jar. It wasn't much, but it was honest. It was hers. At 4:30, Rosa placed the wine glasses on the table, spacing them carefully. She had never served expensive wine before, but she had watched enough at Matthew's house to know the etiquette. She lit 2 candles she had saved from a Christmas box and dimmed the lights just enough to create a warm atmosphere. Camilla changed into her best dress, a lavender cotton piece with tiny daisies, and tied her curls back with a ribbon. The apartment was quiet at 5:30. Everything was ready. The food was warm, the table was set, and the house smelled like home. Rosa stood by the window, her hands clasped together, her heart beating with a steady, anxious rhythm. The moment had arrived. All that was left was to wait. At exactly 6 o'clock in the evening, a sleek black Tesla pulled into the parking lot. Rosa watched from behind the curtain as Matthew stepped out, dressed in dark jeans, a tailored blazer, and a crisp white shirt. He carried a bottle of wine in one hand and glanced at the building as if trying to orient himself in unfamiliar territory. Rosa opened the door just before he could knock. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. "Good evening," Matthew said, offering the bottle. "Thank you for inviting me." "Thank you for coming," Rosa replied, taking the wine with both hands, careful not to drop it. "Please come in." He stepped inside slowly, his eyes taking in the space. The living room was small but warm, filled with signs of life. A framed drawing by Camilla, a crocheted blanket folded on the couch, a bookshelf with worn paperbacks and photo albums. The table was set for 3. Candles flickered gently in the center. Camilla emerged shyly from the hallway. Rosa placed a hand on her back. "This is my daughter, Camilla." Matthew extended a hand with a soft smile. "Nice to meet you, Camilla." The girl nodded, her eyes wide. "Nice to meet you, too, sir." Rosa served the food with quiet grace. She explained each dish briefly. The tamales were her grandmother's recipe. The chili stew was something her mother used to make. The rice pudding was a tradition in their home. Matthew listened attentively, complimenting the aroma, the presentation, the textures. They ate slowly. The conversation drifted from safe topics, Seattle's unpredictable weather, favorite foods, Camilla's school, to more personal ground. Matthew asked Rosa how long she'd lived in Tacoma. She told him about her move from New Mexico, about working different jobs to support Camilla after her husband disappeared before the baby was born. Her voice remained calm, but her eyes carried the depth of those years. Matthew didn't interrupt. He watched, listened, absorbed. He noticed how Rosa poured his water before her own, how she kept checking on Camilla between sentences, how she lit up when talking about family traditions. It struck him how much of her life had gone unseen. When the meal ended, Rosa served coffee with dessert. The arroz con leche was creamy, fragrant, perfect. Camilla beamed as Matthew took a second helping. "This is extraordinary," he said sincerely. "All of it, thank you." Rosa smiled, a soft, tired smile. "It was my pleasure." Matthew paused, glancing around again. The wine, the flowers, the repainted door, the meticulous detail. In everything. They all told a story he hadn't expected, and as they sat in that small apartment, the scent of cinnamon in the air, he realized the meal wasn't just generous, it was costly. And not in money alone. The candlelight had softened the edges of the evening, wrapping everything in a delicate golden hue. The plates had been cleared, and the air now carried the faint sweetness of cinnamon and burnt sugar from the arroz con leche. Rosa poured the last of the coffee into Matthew's cup, her movements precise and gentle. Camilla sat cross-legged on the living room rug, flipping through a book, occasionally glancing up at her mother and their guest, trying to read the mood. Matthew leaned back slightly in his chair, taking in the modest apartment with new eyes. There was nothing luxurious within the walls, yet nothing felt lacking. He noticed the handmade curtains, slightly faded from years of sun but meticulously hemmed. He noticed the threadbare couch with a throw blanket folded neatly across its back. On the wall near the hallway, there was a photograph of Rosa as a younger woman, holding a baby in her arms with the expression of someone determined to protect the world that rested in her arms. "You've made this place feel real," Matthew said quietly. "It's peaceful here." Rosa smiled faintly, nodding, not sure how to respond. She reached over to adjust the wick of one candle that had begun to flicker. Silence settled again, not uncomfortable, but reflective. The kind of silence that arises when two people realize the world they share, even if briefly, has narrowed into something intimate and honest. "You must have worked very hard to prepare all of this," Matthew said after a pause. "Long time since I've had a meal that felt like it came from someone's soul." "It's been a..." Rosa looked at her hands. They were tired hands, hands that had scrubbed, lifted, chopped and sewn. She curled her fingers slightly, almost protectively. Then she offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It wasn't much," and she said, "just things I had at home." Matthew tilted his head. "I doubt that. There's nothing about this meal that was ordinary." She glanced at him, her expression somewhere between guarded and amused. Then, with a soft exhale, she said, "Well, maybe not everything was at home." He raised an eyebrow slightly, waiting without pressing. Rosa took a sip of her coffee, set the cup down and let the truth roll out, not in confession but as a quiet declaration. "I spent what I had left, what was supposed to last the rest of the month. Groceries, paint, even the flowers. My card was declined yesterday when I tried to buy ice. I had to use the change I'd saved in a jar for emergencies. I scraped together enough, just barely." Matthew sat still, absorbing the words. His fingers traced the edge of the porcelain cup slowly. There was no drama in Rosa's voice, no request for sympathy. She said it like a fact, like the weather, like something that simply was. "You spent all of that for tonight?" he asked, his voice low. Rosa gave a small shrug, more weary than proud. "It mattered. This mattered to me. It wasn't about impressing you. I just wanted to do something right, something that showed who I am, not just what I do." Her eyes shimmered for a brief moment, though she blinked it away quickly. "I didn't mean to say that like it was a complaint. Please don't misunderstand. I'm grateful you came, truly." Matthew's gaze didn't waver. In his world, dinners were expenses written off, plates served by professionals in uniforms, ingredients flown in from distant countries. He had spent thousands on meals that he barely remembered. But this dinner, made from savings, meant to buy school supplies and electricity, was something else entirely. It was a sacrifice, and he had walked into it blindly. "I don't think I've ever been honored like this," he said after a moment. "Ballroom. Not in any boardroom." Or Rosa looked away, her expression unreadable. "It wasn't meant to be a statement," she replied, "just dinner." "But it was," Matthew said, his voice steadier now, a very loud one. They sat in silence again, this time heavier. Camilla had fallen asleep on the floor, her book resting against her cheek. Rosa rose quietly, lifted her daughter in her arms and carried her to the bedroom, the soft creak of the floor the only sound accompanying her. When she returned, Matthew had stood up and was looking at the bookshelf near the door. "You read a lot," he said, noting the mix of novels, cookbooks, and Spanish poetry. "When I have time," Rosa replied. "Live in. Books remind me that the world is bigger than the space I." Matthew nodded, slowly taking it all in. He saw now what he had overlooked for years, not just Rosa's efficiency, but her depth. She wasn't just the woman who ensured his laundry was folded and his kitchen spotless. She was a builder of worlds in a space no larger than a single room in his mansion. A woman who had managed to raise a child, maintain dignity, and still find beauty in ordinary things. He turned to face her again. "People, but I've been blind. You know, I always thought I noticed everything, that I could read." Rosa shook her head, not harshly, deeper. "You weren't blind. You just never had a reason to look." That struck him, not as an accusation, but as an undeniable truth. He had never looked beyond her utility, never wondered about the person behind the uniform. And now, with her words still echoing in the air, he realized he had been surrounded by people like Rosa his whole life, silent, dependable, invisible, and he had never really seen any of them. He reached into his coat pocket and held out a card. "Anything I can do? This is my direct number. If there's ever Rosa didn't take it." She looked at the card, then at him. "Thank you," she said, her voice firm, "but tonight wasn't about getting something in return." "I know," he replied, his hand slowly lowering, "but still." She gave him a nod of appreciation, and for a long moment they stood in the small space, two people from very different worlds joined by something as simple and as profound as a shared meal. Matthew left quietly, the night air crisp as he stepped outside. He walked slowly to his car, the wine bottle now empty in the crook of his arm. As he drove back across the bridge towards Seattle, the city lights blurred in his vision. He thought about the flickering candles, the smell of roasted chilies, the photo on the hallway wall, and most of all, he thought about a woman who had given everything she had, not to impress, but to express. It was just dinner, but it would not be forgotten. The drive home was unusually quiet, even for someone accustomed to silence. Matthew Callahan, alone in the smooth hum of his electric car, didn't play music. He didn't call anyone. He didn't scroll through news or listen to the audiobook paused on his dashboard screen. He simply drove, headlights cutting through the night, his thoughts louder than any noise around him. The city he knew so well drifted by in a blur, glowing storefronts, empty sidewalks, the shimmer of buildings reflected on Lake Washington, but none of it registered. His mind remained in that small apartment in Tacoma. He couldn't stop hearing her voice. Not the actual words, but the tone, the cadence, the meaning behind the things Rosa had said. "I spent what I had left." That sentence echoed in his head like a bell struck once, but ringing endlessly. It wasn't dramatic. She hadn't said it with bitterness or expectation. She had said it as a statement of fact, as something she had accepted without complaint. And yet it pierced deeper than any accusation could have. When he arrived at his house, everything looked the same. The gates opened with a quiet click, the motion lights turned on automatically, and the warmth of recessed lighting greeted him inside. His coat hung itself neatly on a rack by the entrance. The quiet familiarity of luxury wrapped around him, but for the first time in a long while, it felt uncomfortable. He stood in the foyer for a moment, staring at the clean lines of his home, the imported artwork, the designer furniture, the silence that once comforted but now accused. He wandered into the kitchen. The marble countertops gleamed under the soft lights. A bowl of untouched fruit sat next to the induction cooktop. Everything was spotless, in order, prepared. Yet tonight, it all felt hollow. He ran his fingers along the edge of the counter and let out a slow breath. Then he sat on one of the stools, elbows on the counter, staring into nothing. For a man who had built his life on logic, this night offered no metrics, no graphs, no patterns to predict or understand. It was emotion, raw, silent, undeniable. He thought about Rosa's hands, worn from years of labor, presenting dish after dish with grace. He thought about her eyes as she spoke of spending her last savings and how she smiled through the weight of it. He thought about Camilla's shy glances, her polite curiosity, the way she looked at her mother with unfiltered, admiration. He sat there for over an hour. No phone calls, no work emails, no movement, just the persistent echo of a truth he could no longer unsee. Eventually he stood up and walked to the large floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the city lights like threads of gold on black silk. It was beautiful, and it should have comforted him. But tonight, he saw it differently. He saw the separation, the distance, the quiet privilege of standing behind glass, while others lived their lives on the other side. In the following days, Matthew returned to his schedule. Meetings resumed, reports were reviewed. Business as usual reasserted itself with efficient precision. But something inside him had shifted. He found himself distracted during video conferences, his eyes drawn to the corners of his home that now felt excessive. He caught himself hesitating before buying things. Wine for a dinner party, new suits, another antique clock he didn't need. The thought of Rosa's carefully chosen flowers, bought with her last few dollars, haunted him. He began to notice details he had once ignored. The way Rosa moved through his home quieter than the air, the way she always folded the bath towels the same way, or how she left a tiny sprig of lavender in the guest rooms. He remembered the mornings when she would arrive before anyone else, unlocking the back gate herself, letting in the day with a kind of quiet ceremony. He remembered the years he had lived among these gestures without ever truly seeing them. That realization came with shame, not the kind that was loud or performative, but the deep kind that settled in the gut. The shame of having overlooked someone's humanity, not because he was cruel, but because he had simply not made space to see it. He had lived his life at a height where the view was always wide but never close. Rosa had changed that with a simple invitation. He thought about calling her many times, but each time he picked up his phone he stopped. What would he say? That he was sorry? That he hadn't meant to ignore her sacrifices? That he had come to appreciate her only after seeing what she could give with so little? None of it felt adequate. Instead, he began observing, quietly. He asked his assistant to hold off on replacing Rosa when she took a day off. He reviewed her employment record. Perfect attendance, no complaints, consistent performance. There wasn't a single note of her asking for a raise in nearly 6 years. Her pay, while above minimum wage, was nowhere near what someone of her dedication deserved. He also started noticing his own staff more carefully. The gardener who worked through the rain, the night security guard who stood outside in freezing temperatures. He realized that his home functioned because of people like them, people whose names he barely knew, people who brought care into his life in ways he had never acknowledged. One night, he found himself staring at his own dining table. It was long, elegant, capable of seating 10, but he had not used it for anything meaningful in months. He remembered the table at Rosa's house, small, cramped, surrounded by love. There had been no grandeur, only intention. Every bite of food had been prepared with attention. Every word spoken had weight. It was, in its own way, a kind of truth he had not known he was hungry for. That silence inside him had become something else now. Not a void, but a space where awareness had grown, where guilt coexisted with admiration. He didn't yet know what to do with it, but he knew it mattered. He knew that he could no longer return to the person he had been before. And so, each night before he went to bed, Matthew would stand once more by the window. He would look out over the lake, but this time, he didn't see reflections. He saw Rosa's tiny apartment. He saw Camilla's curious eyes. He saw candles, flickering beside simple plates. He saw a life filled with grace, not in spite of hardship, but because of it. It was, without a doubt, the most important silence he had ever known. The following morning arrived grey and overcast, the kind of Seattle day that blurred time, stretching hours into a quiet fog. Matthew Callahan woke earlier than usual, without the need for an alarm or the routine buzz of his calendar. He lay in bed, eyes open, the softness of his 1,000-thread-count sheets doing little to comfort the agitation beneath his skin. He felt restless in a way that had nothing to do with work or deadlines, and everything to do with the weight of something unspoken that now lived within him. By 7 o'clock, he was in his study, still in a sweatshirt and jeans, seated at the edge of his desk rather than behind it. His assistant, Chelsea, was not scheduled to arrive until 9. The house was silent, save for the occasional hum of the HVAC system and the sound of rain tapping softly against the tall windows. He opened his laptop, stared at the screen, and typed nothing. Instead, his hand reached instinctively into the drawer, pulling out a thin leather notebook he hadn't opened in years. It wasn't a journal in the traditional sense, but a space where he sometimes drafted ideas that mattered more to him than to his investors. Initiatives, donations, notes from people he'd helped anonymously. He flipped through the pages until he found a blank one. Slowly, deliberately, he began to write. Camilla. He paused, struck by the simplicity of the name, the weight it now carried. He thought of her smile, shy but luminous, and the way she looked at her mother like Rosa was both anchor and sail. He knew that expression. It was the look of someone who trusted without condition. He also knew that children like Camilla, brilliant and bright-eyed, often faded into systems too big and indifferent to nurture them. He had seen it before in reports, in data points, in faceless statistics presented by his philanthropic teams. But this wasn't a statistic. This was Camilla. An hour later, Matthew left his home, not in a suit or driven by his usual chauffeur, but alone, in his own car, with a bouquet of fresh lilies on the passenger seat and a yellow envelope tucked into the inner pocket of his jacket. The drive to Tacoma felt different now, more familiar, less like crossing into another world and more like returning to something unfinished. He arrived at Rosa's apartment unannounced, hesitant but resolute. He climbed the stairs, the lilies trembling slightly in his hand as he knocked on the door. It was mid-morning, and he wondered if Rosa was even home. The door opened slowly. Rosa stood there dressed in casual jeans and a soft grey sweater, her expression shifting instantly from surprise to concern. "Mr. Callahan," she said, stepping back instinctively. "Is everything all right?" He gave a small nod. "Yes, I hope I'm not intruding." Rosa glanced behind her toward the living room, then stepped aside. "Come in." The apartment was quieter than before. Camilla was likely at school. The scent of coffee lingered in the air, mingled with something floral and warm. Matthew stepped inside, holding out the flowers. "These are for you. I thought they might brighten the room." She hesitated before taking them. "Thank you. They're beautiful." He stood awkwardly for a moment, then pulled the envelope from his pocket and held it out. "I didn't come here to overwhelm you, but I've been thinking a lot about that night, about everything, and I realized there's something I can do. Not as a boss, not as someone who feels guilty, but as a person who truly respects what you've done, what you've given." Rosa looked at the envelope but didn't take it. Her body stiffened slightly. "What is it?" Matthew's voice softened. "It's a letter and a proposal. I'd like to invest in Camilla's future, education, mentorship, whatever she needs. I don't want to interfere, and I'm not asking for anything in return. I want to make sure she gets every opportunity." Rosa's gaze lingered on him, unreadable, and then on the envelope. "I don't want charity," she said, her voice steady. "It's not charity," he replied. "It's gratitude." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked over to the kitchen counter, placing the flowers in an empty pitcher. Her hands moved slowly, her back to him. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked, not turning around. "Because I've lived a life surrounded by people who take more than they give. You gave everything without expecting anything back. That changed me." The silence between them stretched, heavy and unresolved. "I'll think about it," she finally said, still facing away. Matthew nodded, understanding more was not needed. He placed the envelope gently on the table and walked toward the door. "If you decide it's not right, just tear it up. But if it helps, if it makes things even slightly easier, I hope you'll consider it." As he stepped outside, the clouds broke slightly above, allowing thin rays of sunlight to filter through. He stood for a moment on the small concrete landing, breathing in the air tinged with moisture and morning coffee. Behind him, Rosa remained inside, the envelope untouched on the table, the pitcher of lilies beginning to open. Her fingers rested on the rim of the vase, her face still turned toward the window. She was not someone easily moved by gestures. Her life had taught her to be cautious, to measure actions against words. But there was something in Matthew's tone, in his presence, that felt different. Not transactional, not patronizing, just human. Later that afternoon, she sat at the table, the envelope finally open in front of her. Inside was a simple letter and a document outlining a full scholarship plan for Camilla, with additional support for tutoring, extracurricular activities, and future college placement. There was no contract, no condition, no obligation, just a promise signed in ink by a man who had everything but had never been given the chance to give something that truly mattered. She folded the letter slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. In the quiet hum of her small apartment, Rosa realized that the dinner, the sacrifice, the risk, it had all been seen. And not just seen, but understood. Still, she needed time. Time to think. Time to make peace with what help meant, and whether accepting it would cost her more than money ever could. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a personal decision. For Matthew. It would be one for her, too. 2 days passed without a word. Matthew, though preoccupied with work obligations and corporate matters that demanded his attention, found his thoughts persistently drawn back to the yellow envelope left on Rosa's table. He hadn't expected an immediate response. In truth, he hadn't expected her to say yes at all. He had offered not to erase a wrong, but to acknowledge a truth. The silence that followed didn't disappoint him. It humbled him. Still, it opened a space that others around him quickly noticed. His siblings, Carter and Allison, had always been involved, sometimes too involved, in his personal life. With the kind of wealth and public presence Matthew had cultivated, every choice he made echoed in boardrooms and gossip columns alike. The dinner at Rosa's apartment had not been public knowledge, but word of his recent distraction, his skipped gala appearance, and a handful of internal meetings pushed to voicemail began stirring the waters. Carter, ever the tactician, noticed first. "You've been off," he said bluntly one evening as they sat in Matthew's penthouse office overlooking the Sound. "Missing calls, postponing meetings. Something going on?" Matthew didn't answer right away. He poured himself a glass of water, sat across from his younger brother, and finally said, "I had dinner with someone who works for me, Rosa." Carter blinked. "Rosa? The maid?" Matthew nodded. "She invited me. I went. It changed how I see things." Carter's expression twisted into something between disbelief and amusement. "So now what? You're investing in her life? Setting up trust funds? You're not serious." "I'm very serious," Matthew said quietly. Allison joined the conversation the next morning. She had seen the draft of the education grant through a mutual contact in the family office and arrived at Matthew's home unannounced, sharp and cold as the rain on her coat. "Matthew," she said as she stepped inside, "really is. You cannot do this. You don't know who this woman." He remained calm. "I know her better than most people who sit at our dinner table. She cleans your house. That doesn't mean she's worthy of a six-figure handout." "It's not a handout," he replied. "Chance. It's an investment. In her daughter. In someone who deserves." Allison's face tightened. "Do you have any idea how that looks? A billionaire rewarding his maid. People are going to twist it. They'll call it a publicity stunt or worse." "I don't care how it looks," he said, his voice rising slightly for the first time. "I care about what it is." She folded her arms. "That. You're being irrational, emotional, and people will take advantage of." Matthew walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "If helping someone makes me irrational, then I don't want to be rational. If seeing dignity in someone you never noticed before makes me emotional, then good." "You're letting her manipulate you," Allison snapped. He turned sharply. "She didn't ask for anything. I went to her." Carter, who had come in halfway through the exchange, leaned against the doorframe. "Just be careful, Matt. These kinds of decisions have consequences. For you, for the company, for all of us." Matthew said nothing. His silence wasn't agreement. It was fatigue. He had spent his life justifying choices to people who couldn't see past optics. Now, he had made a decision based not on strategy, but on clarity. That unsettled them more than anything. Meanwhile, in Tacoma, Rosa faced her own form of scrutiny. News of Matthew's visit spread quickly among the residents of her building. She hadn't spoken to anyone about it, but someone must have seen him, his car, his flowers, the way he left with a look on his face that was different from the cool indifference they all knew from television interviews and press releases. By the end of the week, Rosa couldn't walk down the hallway without hearing whispers. Got a rich man coming to her door now. Did you hear? Her boss wants to pay. For her kids' school. She must have done something to earn that kind of attention. She's one neighbor, a woman she had once shared soup with during a power outage, asked outright, "So what did you offer him in return?" Rosa didn't respond. She closed her door quietly and leaned against it, her heart heavy with a kind of shame she didn't deserve. She hadn't asked for the visit. She hadn't lobbied for support. She had simply made dinner, and that dinner somehow had exposed her more than any secret ever could. At work, she kept her head down. Matthew wasn't there the next 2 days, and she was grateful. She needed space to think, to breathe. She cleaned his home with the same precision, but now the silence inside the mansion echoed differently. It no longer felt like absence. It felt like something waiting. Back home, Camilla noticed the change in her mother's mood. She asked once, "Something wrong?" Rosa immediately pulled her close. "Did I do? No, mi vida. You've done everything, right?" Camilla looked up at her. "Then why are people talking about us like we did something bad?" Rosa hesitated. Reasons to explain it. "Because sometimes when people don't understand something, they make up." Camilla thought about that and nodded slowly. "But we know the truth, right?" Rosa kissed her daughter's forehead. "Yes, we know the truth." She kept the envelope. From Matthew in the drawer next to her bed. She hadn't responded to him yet, not because she didn't appreciate the offer, but because accepting it meant redefining something within herself. It meant opening her life to a generosity that scared her more than rejection. It meant allowing her daughter to benefit from a system that had always seemed distant, impersonal, unattainable. She wasn't afraid of charity. She was afraid of becoming a symbol, of being talked about, reduced, dissected. She had spent years keeping her dignity by staying invisible. Now, visibility threatened that balance. And yet, a small part of her began to wonder, what if this attention wasn't a loss of dignity, but the beginning of reclaiming it? That question, unspoken but constant, followed her through the week. In the supermarket, where strangers looked, too long. At the bus stop, where old friends suddenly seemed hesitant. In her own hallway, where the silence grew thicker, both Rosa and Matthew now stood in the aftermath of a single dinner that had fractured their realities. Both were being questioned, judged, scrutinized, not for wrongdoing, but for choosing something rare and human in a world that often preferred distance. They had done nothing wrong, but the world around them couldn't decide whether that was enough. The unease that had taken root in Matthew's life refused to dissipate. It clung to him during board meetings, trailed him through crowded hallways, and haunted him in quiet moments. He had never struggled to justify his choices before. His life was governed by decisions based on data, opportunity, and long-term gains. But this dinner, this act of generosity, this connection to Rosa and Camilla, was not something he could measure. And for that reason alone, it rattled the people around him. Despite his siblings' warnings and the cautious whispers that crept into his professional circles, Matthew found himself thinking not of repercussions but of questions. Who was Rosa, really? Beyond the quiet grace and the worn hands, beyond her devotion to work and her evident love for her daughter, who had she been before? What had life demanded of her that made her so careful, so private, and yet so unshakably dignified? He didn't want to investigate her, not in the way corporations usually investigated people. He wanted to understand, to see the full portrait of someone he'd only known through glimpses in hallways and quiet exchanges. So he asked Chelsea, his assistant, to look into public records, not invasively, but respectfully. He gave clear instructions: do not dig into personal correspondence, do not contact anyone, do not pursue anything that would embarrass or expose, just the basics. He needed to understand the context, the story that Rosa had never volunteered. A few days later, Chelsea placed a slim manila folder on his desk. It contained copies of public files, school transcripts and newspaper clippings that painted a life Matthew could hardly believe belonged to the same woman who mopped his floors and folded his shirts. Rosa Martinez had once been a nursing student at the University of New Mexico. She had been awarded a merit-based scholarship, was on track to graduate with honors, and had completed her clinical hours ahead of schedule. Professors had praised her compassion, her precision, and her quiet leadership. Then, abruptly, her academic record ended in the middle of her final year. The attached hospital record explained why. Her mother, Sofia Martinez, had been diagnosed with a degenerative neurological disease, one that required full-time care. Rosa had dropped out to become that caregiver. There was no sign of bitterness in the letters she sent to the university registrar. Only gratitude for the opportunity she had been given, and a quiet request to keep her transcript on file in case she ever returned. She never did. After her mother passed away, Rosa re-entered the workforce as a cleaner in Albuquerque. She met a man who worked construction. There was no marriage license, but a birth certificate showed Camilla's full name, Camilla Elena Martinez, and the father listed as unavailable. No support payments, no legal dispute, just absence. By the time Camilla was 3, Rosa had moved north to Washington State, where she worked for 2 small cleaning services before being hired by the Callahan estate through a staffing agency. Her employment history since then had been consistent, without complaint or absence. Her file was the picture of reliability, but behind it Matthew now saw a mosaic of sacrifice and strength. He sat in his office, reading slowly, page by page, the manila folder open in front of him like a window into a different kind of life. He didn't know what he had expected to find, but it wasn't this. It wasn't the image of a brilliant young woman giving up her future for a dying parent. It wasn't the single mother raising a daughter without help or recognition. It wasn't this quiet heroism lived without audience or applause. Matthew leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. For all the people he had mentored, all the causes he had supported, he had never once asked about the past of someone who stood right beside him every day. Not truly, not with the curiosity or respect they deserved. He thought about the way Rosa spoke, with intention, with pause, always grounded. He remembered how she had said, "I just wanted to do something right, something that showed who I am, not just what I do." Now he understood the depth of that statement. She wasn't looking for pity or rescue. She was offering her truth, in the only way she knew how, through action, through care, through a meal made from memory and love. Later that evening, unable to shake the weight of what he'd learned, Matthew visited the university's online archive. He found a photo of Rosa in a digital yearbook, young, hopeful, wearing a white lab coat with her hair tied back, holding a stethoscope. The caption beneath read, "Rosa Martinez, class of 2008, future RN." That future had never arrived, but its potential had never vanished. The next morning, Matthew sent a letter to the University of New Mexico's scholarship office. He asked about reactivating a transcript, reinstating a dormant account in case a former student ever wanted to return. He didn't name Rosa, but he gave enough information for the staff to understand the situation. The reply came 2 days later. Yes, it could be done. And yes, her academic credits remained intact, pending a final exam and clinical review. Matthew printed that email and placed it inside the same yellow envelope he had originally given Rosa. He didn't intend to force it into her hands. He didn't even know if she'd want to revisit that path. But he believed in offering options, in opening doors that life had once closed. Meanwhile, Rosa, unaware of the discovery unfolding in her employer's hands, continued her days with quiet steadiness. The talk among neighbors had quieted slightly, though suspicion lingered like morning fog. At work, she focused on details, grateful for the small barrier that her tasks provided against a world that now seemed too curious, too judgmental. One afternoon, while folding linens in Matthew's laundry room, she found a small note left on the counter. It wasn't in an envelope, it wasn't typed, just a handwritten sentence on heavy notepaper. "I see you." No name, no signature. But she recognized the handwriting. Rosa held the note for a long time, reading it over and over. The words were simple, but they struck like thunder. They said more than any speech, any apology, any offering. They said, "I've looked past the surface. I understand, even if just a little, and I respect what I see." That evening, Rosa stood at her kitchen window, looking out at the parking lot as twilight set in. Camilla was finishing her homework on the couch, humming softly. The envelope Matthew had given her sat unopened on the shelf. But the note, those 3 quiet words, lay beside it now. She wasn't ready to respond, not yet. But she was no longer afraid of being seen. Not because she had something to prove, but because someone finally had chosen to understand. The day Matthew decided to take his intentions one step further began with no warning, no catalyst, just a growing certainty that his contribution to Rosa's life couldn't end with a scholarship tucked in an envelope or quiet letters slipped into her routine. He knew enough now, not only of her story, but of the quiet power she embodied. Her life had not been one of dependence, but of unrelenting responsibility. Any gesture he made had to honor that, or it would be worse than doing nothing at all. That morning, he called a meeting with the legal and philanthropic team from his family foundation. The Callahan Foundation, created decades earlier in his father's name, had funded everything from medical research to educational programs. Yet Matthew realized how impersonal most of it had become. Sizable checks written to major institutions, impressive statistics presented in quarterly reviews, glossy photos for annual reports. What it lacked was precisely what Rosa had taught him to value: the human connection. In the conference room lined with windows and soft leather chairs, he laid out his plan with deliberate calm. "I want to launch a new initiative, a support program for working mothers, especially single parents who've left school or careers behind to care for family. It needs to be personal, direct, respectful." The room stilled for a moment before someone asked, "In whose name?" Matthew looked out the window. "Sophia Martinez. She was Rosa's mother. She raised a woman who gave up everything to care for her, and I want that legacy to mean something more than quiet sacrifice." There were nods, murmurs of approval. But as they began discussing logistics, budget allocations, naming rights, legal implications, Matthew interrupted. "Before we file anything, I want Rosa to be the first person offered help through this program, not because she needs saving, but because she represents everything this should stand for." No one objected aloud, but a few exchanged glances. Matthew noticed and said nothing. He didn't need their permission. What he needed was her consent. He drove to Tacoma that afternoon, carrying only a single folder and the truth of his decision. Rosa answered the door in a soft-colored blouse and jeans, her eyes tired but kind. She didn't look surprised to see him, but there was a stillness in her posture that made clear she wasn't ready to assume his visit was good news. "I won't stay long, he said as she let him in. He handed her the folder. She didn't open it immediately. Instead, she waited, standing near the kitchen table, her arms crossed lightly over her chest. "It's a proposal," Matthew began, his voice measured. "Not for you to accept anything you don't want. It's a program I'm developing for women like you, strong women who put family before ambition. I named it after your mother." Rosa blinked, her face unreadable. "I want you to be the first to benefit," he continued. "Not just Camilla, you. I know you started nursing school, that your credits are still valid. If you ever want to return, the foundation will support you completely. And if not, we can structure a role for you in the program. As a leader, a mentor, you've lived the experience we want to reach. You could guide it." Rosa said nothing. Her fingers tightened around the folder. Her breathing, usually steady and silent, now came slightly faster. She walked to the window and stared outside for a long moment. "You think this is gratitude?" she said at last, not turning to face him. "You think this is righting an imbalance, but it feels like being turned into something I didn't ask to become." Matthew frowned, unsure. "What do you mean?" She turned, the folder now resting on the table unopened. Her eyes were fierce, not angry, but raw. "I gave you dinner. A simple dinner. I spent more than I should have, yes. But I did that because It mattered to me. It was something I could offer without feeling small. Now you want to name a program after my mother and put me in charge of it? You want to give me a path back to a dream I buried years ago. And that should feel like a miracle, but instead it terrifies me. Matthew opened his mouth, but she raised a hand gently. Do you know what people will say? She continued. They already think I've done something wrong to get your attention, that I've sold myself somehow. They look at me like I've betrayed their sense of fairness by accepting your kindness. If I take this, if I stand next to you as anything other than your maid, I lose the safety I've built. I don't care what they say, he replied. But I have to, she said softly, because I live in their world. I ride the same buses, I shop at the same stores. I raise my daughter in a neighborhood where people survive by keeping their dignity private. If I accept this, if I let you give me a new life, I don't know who I'll be. I'm afraid I'll lose myself in your world before I've figured out how to bring my daughter through hers. Matthew stood in the middle of the room, frozen, not by her refusal, but by the clarity of her fear. He had thought he understood, but this was deeper. She wasn't pushing back out of pride. She was protecting something fragile and real, her identity, her community, her right to define what help meant on her terms. You wouldn't be alone in this, he said quietly. Be choosing a new chapter. You wouldn't owe anyone anything. You'd just... And what if I'm not ready? She asked. Then I'll wait. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the sound of the refrigerator humming and the faint voices of children playing outside. I never wanted to be a symbol, Rosa whispered. I don't want you to be one either, he replied. I just want you to have options. Rosa walked over and picked up the folder again. She held it to her chest, still not opening it. I need time, she said. Real time. And space. You have it. He left without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Rosa stood in the kitchen, the folder in her hands like a weight she couldn't yet carry. She looked at the envelope on the shelf, at the note that said, I see you. Then she sat down at the table and closed her eyes. The offer was generous, thoughtful, sincere, but accepting it would mean stepping into a world that hadn't been built for her. And if she walked into it, she had to do so knowing she could bring her whole self and not leave any part of her behind. It was a Wednesday afternoon, gray and silent, when Camilla decided she couldn't take it anymore. Her mother had been quieter than usual, moving around the apartment like a ghost, always thoughtful, but distracted. Rosa had not yet opened the folder that sat on the table. She passed by it every day, straightened its corners, dusted around it, but never lifted its cover. Camilla had asked once, Are you going to read it? Rosa had only smiled and said, Not today. But Camilla, young as she was, had always been intuitive. She sensed that whatever was in that folder mattered. Not in the way test grades or permission slips mattered, but in a way that shifted something fundamental. She remembered the night Matthew had come for dinner, how her mother had smiled and laughed in ways she rarely did. She remembered the candlelight, the sound of real conversation, the feeling that something rare and beautiful had been shared. That feeling was gone now. In its place was hesitation, a fog that had wrapped itself around their tiny apartment and around Rosa's, usually clear mind. Camilla didn't have the words for all of it, but she had action. And sometimes when the world seems tangled, action is the only thing a heart can reach for. Without telling her mother, Camilla packed her backpack as if going to the library. She tucked her homework inside, along with a small drawing she had made days ago, a sketch of her family, just her and Rosa, with bright colors and a heart between them. Then she walked to the nearest bus stop, the one that took her downtown. She had never traveled to Mercer Island alone, but she knew the route. She had seen the address on an envelope once and remembered the name Callahan on the mailbox. It was a long ride, nearly an hour, but she sat quietly, watching the city pass by. She gripped the folder tightly in her lap, the one she had taken from the kitchen table that morning while Rosa was in the shower. When she reached the edge of the gated property, she hesitated. The place was vast, quiet, surrounded by hedges and stone walls. The front gate had an intercom. Camilla pressed the button and waited. A moment later, a woman's voice answered. "Hello?" "Hi," Camilla said, trying to sound steady. "I'm Camilla Martinez. I need to see Mr. Callahan." There was a pause. Then another voice came on. Male, calm, familiar. "Camilla." "It's me," she said. "Can I come in?" A few seconds passed before the gate opened with a slow, mechanical groan. Camilla walked through, her sneakers soft against the stone path. The garden smelled like rain and pine. When she reached the door, it opened before she could knock. Matthew stood there, surprised but not alarmed. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Camilla nodded, scared. "I brought this." "She won't. Open it." "But I think she wants to. I think she's just—" She handed him the folder. Matthew took it carefully. "She doesn't know I came," Camilla added. "Just didn't say anything. Please don't be mad at her. She didn't say no. Matthew knelt to her level. "Your mom, so she doesn't worry. Thank you for trusting me. Do you want to stay for a bit?" "I can call." Camilla shook her head. "She'll worry, but I'll go back now. I just needed to do this." Matthew nodded. "All right. I'll walk you to the gate." By the time Camilla returned home, Rosa was already searching the apartment in a quiet panic. When her daughter opened the door, Rosa rushed to her and wrapped her in a tight embrace, checking for injuries, confusion in her voice. "Where did you go?" "Camilla, you scared me." "I'm sorry," Camilla whispered. "I went to see him. I gave him the folder. I thought maybe if he knew you were scared, he'd understand better." Rosa pulled back, stunned. "You took it." "I left him a drawing too," Camilla added. "We are. To show him we're not trying to be anything more than." Rosa sat down, holding her forehead. Then she started to laugh, a soft, breathless laugh filled with disbelief and love. She looked at her daughter and saw not a child who had disobeyed, but someone who had acted with pure instinct and unwavering trust. That evening, Rosa received a letter. It arrived by courier, hand-delivered and sealed in a plain envelope. Inside was a note written in Matthew's handwriting. "She gave me your silence. I returned it with my own. But if you are ready, if you choose to take the next step, I will meet you wherever you are. No stage, no spotlight, just the beginning of a path paved by you." Beneath the note was a second sheet, this one official, formal, yet entirely blank, except for the line at the bottom, "Signature of acceptance." Rosa stared at the paper for a long time. Then she looked at Camilla, asleep on the couch, one arm draped over her school bag. Rosa walked to the table, lit a small candle, and placed the paper beside it. She didn't sign it that night, but the next morning she wrote a letter of her own. It was handwritten on plain stationery, careful and measured. "Mr. Callahan." She signed it with full name, Rosa Elena Martinez. She placed the letter in an envelope and gave it to Camilla to deliver on her way to school. Rosa didn't wait for a reply. She had spoken her truth. For the first time in weeks, the apartment felt still, not with fear or tension, but with clarity. It was not a victory. It was not submission. It was a beginning, one chosen on her terms. The weeks that followed moved with a quiet but unmistakable shift. Rosa, as always, continued her routine with the same discipline that had carried her through the last decade. Early mornings, carefully packed lunches for Camilla, quiet departures to the Callahan residence, and evenings filled with simple dinners, homework and soft conversations. But something beneath that rhythm had changed. There was a lightness in her step, not born of relief, but of direction. Her world had not become easier, but it had finally become hers to shape again. At Matthew's mansion, the transition was discreet. There were no formal announcements, no press releases, no banners. Rosa continued her work as before, laundry folded, surfaces gleaming, linens crisp, but she was no longer unseen. The silence between her and Matthew had transformed into a kind of steady regard. They did not speak often, but when they did, there was depth in their exchanges, an understanding built not on obligation, but on recognition. One morning, while wiping down the long dining table, Rosa found a folder placed at the head seat. Inside was a draft proposal for the Sofia Martinez initiative, now rewritten in her language, figuratively and literally. Gone were the legal terms and rigid structures. In their place were clear principles: autonomy, dignity, education, and support for working mothers who had given up dreams to carry others forward. Rosa reviewed every line. She corrected phrasing, adjusted criteria, suggested ideas. It wasn't about control, it was about voice. She attended 2 planning meetings. At the foundation office, she didn't sit at the head of the table. She didn't speak often, but when she did, the room listened. Not because Matthew insisted, but because her clarity cut through the noise. She asked questions no one else thought to ask. What about undocumented mothers? What about those who couldn't afford to leave one job for school, but could manage 2 part-time roles with childcare support? What about the women who couldn't speak for themselves without fear of being misunderstood? She brought a different kind of intelligence, one that didn't come from spreadsheets but from lived experience. Her contribution was not a favor, it was essential. The board began to see what Matthew had seen, that a program shaped by her story would not just serve others like her, it would be made for them. Back in Tacoma, changes bloomed slowly but surely. Camilla received her scholarship confirmation in a plain envelope, as if it were a routine school document. Rosa had insisted on discretion, but the impact was immediate. Camilla was enrolled at a private school in the nearby district, one that offered an accelerated curriculum, small class sizes, and a focus on social equity. Rosa dropped her off on the first day, standing outside the gates with nervous pride. Camilla turned and waved, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her confidence beaming. At home, Rosa began setting aside time each evening for herself, not for chores, not for bills, but for something more sacred: study. She had retrieved her old nursing textbooks from storage, pages yellowed but notes still legible. She contacted the University of New Mexico registrar and confirmed that her credits were valid. All she needed was to complete one final module and clinical assessment to receive her license. She signed up for the remote refresher course, scheduling time around her work and Camilla's school. It was not fast, it was not easy, but it was hers. Matthew never asked for updates. He did not check in with urgency or expectation. Instead, he made space. He extended a quiet invitation for her to participate in the Foundation's steering committee, to guide decisions about the initiative without needing to step into the spotlight. Rosa accepted, but insisted on remaining anonymous to the recipients. She had no desire to be the face of anyone's campaign. Her contribution would be felt, not flaunted. The Foundation launched its first pilot phase quietly in a modest community center in Burien, a few miles from Rosa's own neighborhood. The program offered on-site childcare, part-time class schedules for women returning to finish high school, or vocational certifications and small monthly stipends to cover basic living expenses during study periods. The women who attended were not told where the funds came from, but they were met with warmth, guidance, and structure. Each participant assigned a mentor who had once faced similar choices. Rosa visited the center twice before the end of the month. She didn't introduce herself. She stood at the back of the room, listening as women discussed their fears, their hopes, their hunger for something more. In their voices, she heard echoes of her own past. She left without speaking. But she returned 2 days later with a donation of books and a note that read, "For the moments you don't believe in yourself, read something that reminds you who you are." At the Callahan residence, the staff began to notice a gentler atmosphere. Matthew was still private, still precise in his expectations, but he moved with more patience. He greeted them more often. He paused to ask about their weekends. Not in a performative way, but with curiosity that had grown from a single dinner, that revealed how much he hadn't known. Rosa remained in her role for a few more months, gradually transitioning her hours to make space for study and mentoring. She declined Matthew's offer to assign a driver for her commutes. She continued to take the bus, sit by the window, watch the city unfold in its daily choreography. There was comfort in knowing she was still part of it, not elevated, not separate, just moving forward. One evening, after Camilla finished her homework, she sat beside her mother and said, "No, Mama. I think I want to be a teacher someday, or maybe a writer." Rosa looked at her surprised. "A writer?" "Yeah. Stories matter. You told one with your food. I want to tell mine with words." Rosa smiled, pulling her daughter close. "Then you will, and you'll do it in your way." Their small apartment had not changed much. Same walls, same furniture, same flickering hallway light. But it felt transformed, not because of money, not because of prestige, because of choice, because they now lived not in reaction to hardship, but in pursuit of possibility. One act had sparked it. One dinner. One night where silence broke and honesty sat at the table. And now that truth was unfolding in steps both small and monumental. Quiet progress, steady hands. A life reclaimed, not as a gift, but as a right. The auditorium was filled with soft murmurs, the sound of folding chairs creaking under shifting weight, and the occasional burst of applause as one student after another crossed the stage. It was Camilla's high school graduation, an ordinary ceremony in many ways, with rows of parents holding back tears, teachers clapping politely, and students smiling through nerves. But for Rosa, seated in the middle of the crowd, nothing about, this day felt ordinary. She had risen before sunrise, unable to sleep, her hands trembling slightly as she braided Camilla's hair and helped her adjust the pressed white gown. There had been many milestones over the years: her daughter's first day at the new school, her first book report, her first school play. But this moment held a gravity that settled deep in Rosa's chest, not because it was the end of a phase, but because of how it had begun. The memory of that night, of the dinner, the scent of spices lingering in the air, the flickering candlelight, and Matthew seated at her humble table, was no longer just a recollection. It had become a cornerstone. Everything that followed had unfolded quietly, with care and hesitation, but steadily. And now, Camilla stood ready to speak, valedictorian of her class, confident and composed, walking toward the podium with calm purpose. Rosa sat frozen, her breath caught somewhere between pride and disbelief. Camilla adjusted the microphone, scanning the crowd until her eyes settled on her mother. She smiled briefly, then began to speak, not with grandiosity, but with a quiet certainty that commanded attention. "When I was 10, she said, my mum invited someone to dinner. He wasn't a friend, he wasn't family. He was someone she worked for, someone important. And she made that night feel like the most important night of our lives." There was a hush in the audience, not because of who she was talking about, but because of how she spoke. "She spent everything we had on that meal. I didn't know it then. I just thought it was special because we had candles and dessert. But now I understand that it wasn't about the food. It was about what she was offering, herself, her story, her dignity. And it changed everything." Rosa's hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her heart racing. "That dinner became a bridge," Camilla continued, "a bridge between two very different lives. And through it I saw what courage looks like, not the loud kind, but the kind that stands quietly, even when no one is watching. My mum taught me that. And someone else, someone unexpected, listened." She paused, then added, "He didn't try to save us, he just gave her space to rise." And she did. In the front row, Matthew sat still, his hands folded, his face composed, but his eyes visibly damp. No one around him knew his name. He had arrived without announcement, dressed simply, sitting among other parents. It was Rosa who had invited him months before, with a handwritten card that simply said, "You were part of this. You should be here." Camilla's speech continued, touching on perseverance, on education, on community, but she ended with a single sentence that would linger long after the final applause faded. "This diploma belongs to both of us, Mama, because you carried me here." Rosa stood when the ceremony ended, her legs unsteady, but her posture tall. People congratulated her, strangers offered kind words, and a few who had once whispered now looked at her with something resembling awe. But she didn't linger. She moved through the crowd until she found Camilla, who ran into her arms with joyful tears. Matthew approached quietly, waiting until they had shared their moment. When Rosa looked up and saw him. She smiled, not politely but warmly, with the ease of someone who no longer questioned her place. "You made it," she said. "I wouldn't have missed it," he replied. They stood there for a moment, no words needed. Then Camilla handed Matthew a small envelope. "I wrote something," she said. "For you." He took it, surprised, and placed it carefully in his jacket. "Thank you." Later that night, back at the apartment where it had all begun, Rosa lit a single candle and placed it in the center of the table. Not for ceremony, just because it felt right. The apartment had changed over the years. New paint, new furniture, framed photographs along the walls, but the soul of it remained intact. Camilla sat across from her, unwrapping a gift from a teacher, a small leather journal. She flipped through the blank pages with excitement. "I'm going to write about this year," she said, "about how everything began with one meal." Rosa reached for her cup of tea, smiling, decided to be seen. "It didn't begin with the meal, mi amor. It began when outside. The city was quiet, its lights glowing softly in the distance. Inside, the apartment was filled with warmth, not from extravagance or wealth, but from the unmistakable feeling of lives shaped by choice, courage, and compassion." Matthew sat alone in his home, reading the letter Camilla had given him. It was brief, written in careful script. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for not trying to fix us, but for walking beside us. You didn't just accept an invitation. You helped us make space for something more. I hope someday I can do the same for someone else." He folded the letter slowly and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. It was to him the most valuable document he owned. That night, across the quiet stretch of the city, 3 lives rested in separate homes, bound not by blood, not by obligation, but by a single act of shared humanity. It was just dinner, but it changed everything. As the candle in Rosa's apartment flickered one last time before being extinguished, she leaned back in her chair and whispered into the stillness, "It was worth it." And the silence that followed no longer felt empty. It felt full.